Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. And a very, very warm welcome to the special BMZ event titled The Value of Nature in Africa, Mobilizing Action for Protecting Africa's Natural Assets. Of course, this event is also a prime opportunity for us to launch the very first of its kind Africa Protected Natural Assets Report. My name is Nozi Poshabalala, and it is an absolute privilege to moderate this critically important conversation. It's a conversation that brings sharp focus to the economic and social importance of conservation in Africa. In addition to this, if we consider this year, 2021, this year has really highlighted the importance of environment, climate, and biodiversity. And so today we're looking forward to a really robust panel discussion with our panelists. We're looking forward to hearing some statements from African ministers and leading institutions on the continent. We're also looking forward to hearing from you. You, our global audience, I know that we have over 1,000 of you logged on right now and many more that are going to consume this event even after it's been broadcast. And so this is an invitation to you as well to participate in this conversation by sending me your comments and your questions through the chat, and I will try to the best of my ability to integrate your voice into this conversation. The other way in which we can really amplify this conversation is through social media. We're using the following hashtags. It's hashtags green value, hashtag Africa's natural assets, hashtag for nature, and hashtag make nature count. Of course, we are following the handle at BMZ_Bund. Now, we're also going to be live streaming this conversation onto the BMZ website. So if you are wanting to watch it again and to share it with others, that's certainly the place where you need to go. To get us started right now, it gives me such great pleasure to welcome a statement from Mr. Norbert Bartler, who is, of course, the Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development and a member of the German Bundestag, who now extends this special message for us as we get started. Have a listen.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, human health depends on a healthy planet with an intact natural environment. This is one of the key lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic. The outbreak of the pandemic is partly a consequence of the way humankind is exploiting the natural environment worldwide. 3/4 of the world's terrestrial ecosystems and 40% of its marine ecosystems have already been impacted negatively by human action. Every 4 seconds, an area of rainforest the size of a soccer field is lost to logging. Every 11 minutes, a plant or animal species becomes extinct. If this trend continues, 1 million animal and plant species will disappear forever over the next few years. The natural environment is our most valuable asset. It protects us from droughts and floods. It provides clean air, an intact climate, and fresh water. And it serves as a basis for many areas of economic activity. Food, raw materials, medical services, tourism, energy. More than half of the global economy depends on the natural environment and ecosystem services. Many developing countries depend on them completely. Worldwide, we can see that humankind is not protecting the natural environment to the extent that would be necessary. We are putting the prosperity of current and future generations at risk. This is one of the key messages of the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. The report that we are presenting today, with its focus on Africa's protected natural assets, builds on that. Many African German experts have worked together closely to produce this report. It takes stock of the economic and social significance of Africa's 7,000 protected areas. These areas are literally the soil in which Africa's ecological infrastructure can flourish, and they protect the world's natural capital. The people of Africa vitally depend on these areas for their economies and for their fight against poverty and hunger. We will hear more about this in the video. The data in the report also shows that environmental degradation, overexploitation, and climate change are taking a bigger and bigger toll on Africa's protected areas. And many important ecosystems in Africa have not yet been placed under any protection at all. If we do not act now, it is not only Africa's future that will be at risk. We need to stop the destruction of species and ecosystems and manage to reverse global trends. We need to take strong action now and do more to preserve our natural environment, not only in Africa. In practical terms, this means that first, we need far more protected areas, putting 30% of the world's terrestrial areas and 30% of its marine areas under protection is a goal that many of our African partners support. And second, we need better funded protected areas and massive investments in nature conservation. And third, we need better managed protected areas taking account of the rights of local communities and indigenous groups. And fourth, we need a Paris moment for a strong biodiversity agreement for the coming decade. And fifth, we need to find ways of giving a stronger role to the economics of the natural environment in political decision-making. Six, and all countries have to work actively to put in place frameworks for preserving their natural assets, and they need the solidarity of partners such as Germany that support these efforts in many different ways. Without a healthy planet, we will have no future, neither in Africa nor worldwide. So I am glad that we will be listening to many African voices today to learn about the things people are already doing there and about what they need in order to protect Africa's natural assets in the long term. We need to become active now. I look forward to your contributions. Thank you very much.
And it's a clear call for action. What we've heard from Mr. Norbert Bartley is a clear call for action, really speaking to our clarion call to mobilize action for protecting Africa's natural assets. Now, if I just highlight some of those actions that he has challenged us to really embrace, to increase the number of protected areas, to increase the funding and investment that we're earmarking for these areas, to be cognizant of local communities and indigenous knowledge systems in those spaces, to look at a really strong and sustainable framework for biodiversity agreement. Fifthly, he says What about ensuring that we are really tapping into the economics of nature in political decision making? And finally, he talks about a national framework that we are all adopting in our respective countries to make sure that we are contributing positively to protecting Africa's natural assets. And so maybe with that, it's time for us to turn our focus to a short video of this first of its kind report that really speaks to the economic and social importance of Africa's natural resources. Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to this short video.
The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the soil we live on. Nature provides us with vital goods and services. Healthy ecosystems are our most valuable asset. Africa is richly endowed with natural wealth. More than 7,000 conservation areas across the continent are the cornerstones for protecting Africa's natural assets. They provide space for nature to thrive, but they are also intimately linked to African societies. 30% of all Africans, 370 million people, live in close neighborhood to a conservation area. Conservation areas influence human well-being and societal progress far beyond their boundaries. But the value of nature for societies and economies is often invisible and remains underestimated. And yet, key economic sectors in Africa depend on the natural assets that conservation areas protect. Conservation areas secure drinking water and water supply for energy production from hydropower. Protected watersheds feed 40 of Africa's 50 largest drinking water reservoirs and 8 of the largest hydropower facilities in East Africa. They recharge groundwater, reduce sediment flows, and ensure better water quality. Conservation areas make cities more livable and resilient. They provide green infrastructure for over 1,200 cities in Africa, cleaning the air, cooling temperatures, offering space for leisure and education. Conservation areas save lives and keep people healthy. They act as natural barriers to protect African citizens against storms and floodings. They can play a big role in preventing the spread of zoonotic diseases such as Ebola by reducing human exposure to virus-transmitting species. And they are a rich source of medicine. Conservation areas sustain food systems. More than a quarter of Africa's cropland area is located inside conservation areas or within only 10 kilometers distance. Pollination, genetic diversity, reduced soil erosion, improved water supply, and stable local climatic conditions are essential for food production and not replaceable by affordable technologies. Conservation areas are valuable for entire societies. They are safeguards for food, water, and energy security, and for other societal priorities. But Africa's protected natural assets are at risk. In 40 African countries, at least 25% of conservation area land is degrading. Africa's natural wealth is eroding. Business as usual is not an option. We need to put a spotlight on the societal importance of conservation areas. They are critical for protecting biodiversity, but also for providing vital ecosystem services and public goods. We need to understand conservation areas as ecological backbones of healthy and productive landscapes. They need to be managed to ensure the well-being of people today and of future generations. And we need to recognize that ultimately, African societies rely on the stewardship and sustainable use of their natural wealth, both inside and outside conservation areas. Conservation needs to evolve from an environmental issue to a sustainable development issue. It needs to play a key role for more resilient, prosperous, and equitable societies.
Now, I certainly hope that you're going to be getting a copy or accessing the copy of the report for yourself. Do go to the BMZ website to do that, as we talk about the opportunity to really build strong national systems. This report is going to be an important variable for us to consider, and an important resource for us to consider. Again, it's not just about Africa, but getting this right and protecting Africa's natural areas is good for the world. We've heard how this report really contextualizes the risk for us, and it reminds us that it cannot be business as usual. This is not an environmental issue, ladies and gentlemen. This is a sustainable development issue. And so with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the publishers who are going to be joining me now in conversation. We're joined by Madame Vera Schultz. She is the Director of Climate Change, looking after environment and infrastructure at GIZ. Welcome to you, Madame. And joining us via video is Professor Dr. Bernard Hans-Jürgens. He is the head of the thematic area Environment and Society and the Department of Economics, this at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. So, Madame Schultz, let me start off with you. What is the context and the added value of this particular report? And do we need another report on nature? And if we do, why do we need this report?
Thank you so much, Nazipo, for this very kind introduction, and I'm very proud and happy to be part of the launch of this report. Let me first mention this, and I'm also very happy that so many people are taking part in this event. It's really great to see the big interest we can see through this large participation. What the report and the video we just saw make very clear is that we should not perceive protected areas as green islands which stand in the way of development. I think it has been made very clear in this video, but many people still look at protected areas that way, and that is very unfortunately. But it is just the other way around. They contribute very much to the functioning of African economies and the provision of basic services, water, food, and energy, as we just saw. But what we also see is that protected areas do their job very quietly, and we don't hear much from them. So we are very much far away from regularly, consistently, and comprehensively assessing and quantifying the ecosystem services they provide. And that makes it difficult to take their value into account in political decision making. The African Protected Natural Asset Report gives conservation areas a voice. And I'm, as I said, very happy that 1,000 people are here taking part. And we have already a bigger chorus to make us hear and understand. So the report is uncovering the socio-economic importance of protected areas. And it is the first report of its kind and its assessment for the African continent. And it is also comprehensive. And that means that it does not only look at ecosystem services provided by those protected areas, but also on the demand for services, the ecological state of the underlying natural capital stocks, and how policy can respond to the challenges. And what also the report tries to intend is to build bridges between science, between practice, and policy. And we have more than 50 experts, mostly from Africa and Germany, contributing to this report. And these people came from science, from practice, and they were guided by policy. So that means that while working on this report, we already started to build bridges between these different stakeholder groups. And the report, this is also exceptional, I would say, is grounded in local conditions. We have been working together in 6 African countries to assess 10 selected protected areas. And I think that this kind of collaboration is needed to turn the tide for biodiversity, for better recognizing its value.
It's an incredible contribution that you've just given us, Madame Schultz. I mean, you've not only spoken about why it's important, but why this report is important. And you spoke about something that I just want to go to Professor Hans Jürgens with. You mentioned the idea that this report really helps us to build a bridge between the science and policy and practice. And so, Professor Jans Jürgens, as I come to you now, what are the key recommendations from science that allow us to move from science to policy and practice, as Madame Vera Schultz has contributed and has suggested? Over to you, Prof.
Yeah, thank you. We at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, the UFZ, have been engaging in research and scientific policy advice in biodiversity and ecosystem services now for more than a decade. From the TEEP reports, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and subsequent initiatives, we know about the challenges of synthesizing scientific evidence to be useful for policymaking. The evidence presented in this report makes three things, in our view, very, very important. Firstly, as 1/3 of the African population lives in close proximity to conservation areas, conservation management is not only a task for conservation specialists, but an issue that demands broad societal engagement. Experts from diverse areas like agricultural planners, water and energy experts, engineers, foresters, urban planners, etc., should be engaged. Secondly, development visions in Africa, as for example formulated in the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, rely much more strongly on intact natural capital than is broadly recognized. Many technical solutions and infrastructure investments that African countries plan for can only deliver the expected results if intact landscapes and the natural capital they maintain are taken in closer consideration. For example, Africa is the continent with the biggest hydropower potential on Earth, but the enormous investments will only pay off and ensure the much-needed energy security if the watershed protections becomes an essential element of energy planning. Thirdly, at a broader scale, the evidence in this report not only calls for advancing conservation policy, but ultimately for transforming economic development paradigms. African governments are well advised to recognize intact ecosystems not only as a potential resource for short-term economic growth. The welfare and well-being of the majority of the African population directly relies on the ecosystem services generated by intact landscapes. They are the lifeline for the poor. Thus, intact landscapes are the essential element for long-term poverty alleviation and economic development strategies. Natural capital is the stock to build on. It needs to be managed much more wisely, both inside and outside conservation areas, and, as I said, across diverse policy sectors.
Professor Hans Jürgens, those are three really incredible points. I mean, you speak to wide participation, you speak to Agenda 2063. We're always talking about building the Africa we want, and you speak to the point that oftentimes in articulating that vision, we perhaps minimize or completely erase the value of natural capital in doing so, but also the opportunity to throw a real lifeline to the poor by making sure we get this opportunity right. And so, Madame Schultz, let me then come back to you. Having listened to, Professor Hans Jürgens, what do these recommendations that he's shared with us imply for German technical cooperation, especially in the context of the upcoming post-2020 global biodiversity framework? I also want to bring into focus goals such as the 30 by 30 goal for protected landscapes that many stakeholders are calling for. Bringing this all together, what could this mean for German technical cooperation?
Yeah, thank you, Nazipo, for this question. And collaborating for this report with the many colleagues from Africa. I was also very happy here to have Mr. Hans-Jürgens here, because it was also great to collaborate with the Helmholtz Center on this report. So thank you very much for this collaboration to all African colleagues, but also to the colleagues from the Helmholtz Center. Well, Nazipo, I mean, biodiversity is a big issue within GIZ and a very important area of our work. And the environmental pressure we still see on this earth and we face, and the new global biodiversity framework that will hopefully be adopted in China this year and next year, would make the subject even more important for us within GIZ. We all know that the previous goals under the Aichi goals on biodiversity during the last decade has mostly not been achieved, which is very, very sad. And we really are not very happy within GIZ to face this problem. And goals are only helpful when they are taken serious and measures are taken to reach them. Implementation is key, or as State Secretary Bartlett said, we need more action. And we work together as GIZ in many, many countries in Africa, but also around the world in other continents, and support them through technical cooperation on the way and pathway to a more biodiversity-friendly development, which is so important, because if we don't protect biodiversity, we are losing economic perspectives and outlooks. But we also are very much aware within GIZ that implementation is a challenge. And this is what many of our colleagues working in Africa with our African partners experience. We can see that there is a quite high competition for land, and that there is population pressure, and that climate change also makes things not really easier. Financial resources are strained, especially now after the COVID crisis, and data availability is also limited, and implementation of already existing policy frameworks and regulations is at times quite low. So implementation of goals such as the 30 by 30 goal, that is to protect 30% of land and sea area by 2030, will require a much stronger focus on social and economic relevance of natural capital in Africa. This is why I said at the beginning, that we need a stronger voice on the impact of biodiversity and protected areas on economic well-being in Africa. We need to demonstrate its relevance. And I agree with Professor Hans-Jürgen, and I'm hopeful that African Protected Natural Assets report is one piece that helps to move in this direction. And I also would like to thank at that point the BMZ, which made it possible that we could publish and work together with so many partners on this report. And I'm also I'm very much agree with State Secretary Bartley that we, for biodiversity, also need a Paris moment, and I'm looking forward to having it with all these people protecting what we are eager to do now in the future under the new framework. Thank you very much for your attention, Nazipo.
Thank you very much for your excellent contribution. That's a massive thank you to Madame Vera Schultz, and of course to Professor Dr. Hans-Jürgens, who really have given us a beautiful scoping, a framework, and an understanding of the economic and social importance of this report. A couple of things that I take away from this conversation with the publishers is that what this report does is that it really gives conservation a voice. What it does through its recommendations is that it gives us a pathway to action, and it challenges us to ensure that we go beyond goal setting and really focus on what needs to be true for us to really get into the action. And so with that, I'm going to transition into our panel discussion. My panelists are standing by, and I'm going to introduce them shortly. We are, of course, having a conversation about the value of nature in Africa. And in this first round of questions, we're really going to focus on what do we know and what are the challenges to better recognizing this value across decisions. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jürgen Sattler. He is the Director General for International Development Policy for the 2030 Agenda for Climate, and that at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank you very much for making the time to join us. And of course, you will, ladies and gentlemen, see my challenge today. I've got another Dr. Jürgen, but this time it's Dr. Jürgen Fergeler who joins us. He is Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank, and so you'll have to bear with me as I navigate my way between the two Dr. Jürgens. We also have Madame Alice Ruweza. She is the Africa Regional Director for the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF. A massive welcome to you, Madame. And last but certainly not least in this conversation, we have Professor Dr. Kelemani Joe Mulungoy, who is the co-chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and at the Institute for Enhanced Livelihoods. He has given me permission to call him Joe for the rest of this conversation. So that is what you're going to hear going forward. I'm going to start off with Joe because I've got his permission to call him exactly that. I'm going to say to you, so if we look at, what IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform that we've just spoken about, is their Africa assessment really gave us a brilliant overview of the value of nature in Africa. So the question to you really is, what makes Africa's natural assets unique? And if they are as unique as we're saying today, why aren't they widely recognized as such? Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Nozi. First of all, we know that richness of Africa's natural resources is very, very well known. In fact, it is used to develop tourism in many countries in Africa. But we also know that through the report, and we had a good reminder just a few minutes ago through the video, some of the presentation, that the Agenda 2063, which is the Master Plan for Development in Africa, reminded us clearly that Africa's natural resources is really at the heart of development in Africa. Now, knowing that, what is unique about Africa's natural resources, natural assets? Scientists, when they want to describe that, they will say that in Africa, we have the last assemblage of large mammals. So this is what they will say. But we know that it's on that basis that we have a lot of poaching in Africa. We have a lot of exploitation of the resources. International trade usually not in favor of Africans. And it is also because of the uniqueness of Africa's natural resources that many indigenous peoples and local communities, they lost their land, and it was most of the time given to the private sector, and most of the time, again, international or foreign entities. But at the same time, we know that the uniqueness of Africa's natural resources is the basis of the partnership we have with many, many countries, many organizations. So it is very positive. But when I think about uniqueness of Africa's natural resources, natural assets, what comes to my mind is the fact that, unfortunately, we have not been able to assess the value of these assets. And because of that, we take it for granted. It's just like a box filled with jewels, but we don't know what it is there. We need to unlock the box. We need to unlock the potential that we have in the box, and then know exactly what we have and start using it to fight poverty and also to improve the well-being of the people in Africa. So that is one aspect I like to point out. The other aspect is the fact that we don't know the value, and we get them for granted. It reminds me, one of my colleagues all the time are coming to me from Ghana and then telling me that we have a proverb saying that if the 10 cents coin, you don't go out, then you will never get thousands of dollars. So what we have to do, let's open the box, let's understand what we have, let's value it, and then let's start using it. The second point I think about when I want to consider the uniqueness of Africa's natural assets, what I see is that more than any other continent, they are under a lot of pressures. The pressure within the continent, but also a lot of pressure from outside. And what we have from outside requires a lot of international cooperation in order to try to address them, to control the pressure. So this is what I can say. And then reading the report, I was so happy to see that we have a number of cases, a number of examples of Africa's assets, and then how we can protect them. We know the value. And it is a very good document encouraging us to go into that line, to continue trying to understand, trying to assess the value of Africa's natural resources. Thank you.
No, it's an excellent contribution, and I was at pains to try and pause you, but you really gave us some really useful analogies. We've got a box of jewels, and we don't understand what is inside that box of jewels. It's important for us to open it so that the 10 cent can return $1,000. But of course, if there's risk to that box, we need everybody involved to make sure that we are protecting that box. If you're not tweeting that, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what you're tweeting. That is a soundbite and an analogy we're not going to forget. So let me go to Dr. Jürgen Vögele next. And I want to go straight to the mission of the World Bank, which of course is to reduce poverty and to build shared prosperity in developing countries. Given that that's the core mission, what is the role then of nature in fulfilling this mission? And what is the value of nature for shared prosperity in Africa, Dr. Vögele?
Well, first of all, thank you, Nosy, for having me on the call, and a warm hello to everyone on the video and in the panel. Let me first congratulate BMZ for commissioning this study, and also Vera Scholz and the multidisciplinary and multi-regional team that put this report together. I think this report does a really, really good job in pointing out why it is so important to conserve biodiversity and to protect environmental ecosystem services. I was struck by a number of the factoids that you put together in this report. Before I come to what we see at the World Bank, I mean, the fact that 88% of tourism revenue has to do with nature in Africa, that 40 out of 50 reservoirs draw their water from being in proximity to a conservation area, or the fact that a quarter of foods produced either in a conservation area or in close proximity to it, it just shows you there is no way Africa can get out of poverty or can build shared prosperity unless it puts ecosystem services at the heart of its economic development paradigm. So, and we will hear more of this, I think, throughout the course of this conversation. But for us at the World Bank, we also just recently launched a report that made it very, very clear. You cannot have sustainable economic development and growth if you ignore or if you destroy your biodiversity and your ecosystem services. We estimate that within the next 10 years, the world may lose up to $2 to $3 trillion of GDP if we don't turn this around fast. And of course, the poorest countries will be hit the hardest. So poorest countries in Africa, the estimates are 10% of GDP loss very, very quickly. Let me make a couple of other observations. This report attempts, as Dr. Hans-Jürgen has said earlier, to connect science with policy making. This is exactly what we are trying to do at the World Bank. And we've been seeing, like many of you have been seeing in the last 30 years, how hard that is, how we're struggling in the climate space. For 30 years, we've heard the scientists issuing warnings. If you don't do this, these are the consequences you will face. And yet it took us more than 25 years to get to this, what you call the Paris moment. And we're still not there. We're not close. The current agreements that we have on climate will not get us to a within 1.5 degree world or 2 degree world. So we cannot afford to do the same with biodiversity. We have to listen to the science. We have to listen to the analyses, including the economic and detailed analyses that are happening now more and more. And we have to act on the policy front. And the report lays out a number of areas where that action can absolutely be super helpful. And rest assured, this is exactly the focus we are taking at the World Bank. Back to you, Nosy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fergala. And especially when we begin to see that bridge being concretized from science and evidence to policy and practice really makes for an even stronger case. Thank you for sharing that. I want to go to Madame Rueza very quickly, because if we listen to the video that we watch, and of course, if we engage with the report, we see this report is very strong on its focus on societal and economic importance of conservation areas. How does this differ from current conservation approaches in Africa? Is there a fundamental difference? And if it is, what exactly, Madam?
Thank you very much, Nozi. I would also like to congratulate the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and for hosting this event and for this groundbreaking report. A lot of people have already talked about why its importance. And for me, the main point when they talk about is putting conservation at the center of political, economic, and social progress. Is it different? In the past, conservation was mostly for conserving species. But I have to say, for the last decade, the last maybe decade or so, we have seen conservation have a rethink and start to engage people more and to put people at the center for conservation. When you look at Campfire in Zimbabwe and you look at the conservancy model in Namibia and in Kenya and others, you see that we've started developing these co-management and benefit sharing models. And we've also really had a rethink on the way that we involve more and more indigenous communities, indigenous people and local communities in conservation and giving them a voice. We're starting to push ourselves to become even more inclusive. And really, the big thing at the center of our conservation model has been tourism. I think that point has been made. If you look at that tourism dollar, it just not just benefits our parks, but it also benefits our economies. It pays for education and health. It pays for communities and everything. And that has also, for the last 2 years, been threatened by COVID-19. So, and it's really forced us to think about that. And it's forced us to think about how we can make our conservation model more inclusive and engaging more people and engaging society more into it. Because of that, it has shown that it cannot continue to be that model that is only for benefiting others, but actually for benefiting everyone. And the report really makes this case very well, and it forces us as we go forward to really go after this people-centered model and stop seeing protecting nature as an isolated island set aside for the benefit of others, but as critical components of our living landscapes, but also critical components of our economies.
Madame Rueza, thank you very much. I mean, again, you've echoed and reinforced and brought additional value to this question of the importance of the societal and economic relevance of conservation areas. I want to go to Dr. Zattler before I go to some of our statements. Dr. Zattler, again, if we go back to the Africa's Protected Natural Assets report and the video in particular, we saw that it really called for us to move away from seeing this as an environmental issue and instead seeing it as a sustainable development issue. What does this mean for your ministry as a development ministry, and how might you go about supporting this transition?
Yes, thanks a lot, Nosy. Yes, indeed. I think we all are now much more aware of the interlinkages between economic development and the protection of the nature. And there are many examples. You have heard about the floods in Germany. It costs us about 20 billion euro. But perhaps the most prominent example is the COVID crisis. I mean, we all know, and State Secretary Partler has made a reference, that it has to do with the increasing pressure on nature. and therefore pathogens can just spread over and create such problems. So it's doing such a harm. And therefore, I think the interlinkages become more obvious, and the Dasgupta report has, in fact, highlighted these interlinkages, but it's also getting into the minds of ordinary people. Not only in Germany, not only in Europe, but I have the impression all around the world. And the problems in Namibia, for example, in African countries have been mentioned. So it's about avoiding economic losses, but it's also about generating income and jobs. Tourism has been referred to, but also other areas like water. So the main challenge now is to translate this knowledge, this analysis, which is quite obvious and it's getting more and more obvious, into policies and policy making. And this is one reason why we did this study, but there are many other things we have to do, and we are already starting to do. One important issue is to change the incentives. To change the incentives for economic actors, for example, private actors, not to destroy these natural assets, but to build them up. And there's a lot you can do. Perhaps we can come back to this point in the course of the discussion. But as you ask what BMZ is specifically doing, a lot of things, but I would like to highlight one particular initiative we have launched. That's the Green Value Initiative. Here we are working with the African governments and development finance institutions in order to systematically integrate the value of natural assets in political and financial decisions. And in that context, we are partnering with the World Bank. My fellow Jürgen has made a reference with the World Bank, with the ADB, with the World Wildlife Fund, with the UN. So we are trying to forge a coalition to translate what we know about the value of nature into concrete policies, which is not easy.
Dr. Zattler, again, we're coming back. You spoke about the dual mandate of avoiding loss whilst also generating income and jobs. And how do we support the sharpening of policy and action such that we are able to translate what we know onto the ground into lived experiences, which is all excellent. I do want to just acknowledge our global audience. I'm getting so many questions and we're really running out of time. I just wanted to mention some of the issues that have been raised for us to think about. There's been a question about, well, how inclusive are we really if we haven't begun to be deliberate about including agricultural planners and urban planners. And there's an opportunity there to really widen our understanding of inclusivity in solutioning. There was a question on where are we really when it comes to the quantification of ecosystem values, especially if we look at biodiversity. So, relative to where we want to go, how much progress have we really made? And I love this question from Maximum Jondo, where Maximum is saying, well, what about biodiversity beyond protected areas? Are we maybe being too tight in the scope? But before we get to maybe reflect on some of those questions, allow me to turn to two video statements. I'm going to start off by introducing the voice of Dr. Baumia Votse Rahenira, who is, of course, the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development from the Republic of Madagascar. And in this contribution, we'll hear the minister discussing the economic importance of the environment and nature conservation, and really reflecting on the green value study that was actually conducted in the Ankara-Fansika National Park in Madagascar. Have a listen.
Pour répondre à la question sur l'importance économique de l'environnement et de la nature, ainsi que la protection à Madagascar, La loi elle-même, loi numéro 2015-005 du 23 mars 2015, portant refonte du Code des aires protégées, reconnaît à la fois le rôle des aires protégées dans la protection et le maintien de la diversité biologique, la conservation des valeurs particulières du patrimoine naturel et culturel et l'utilisation durable des ressources naturelles, contribuant à la réduction de la pauvreté, et la nécessité d'adopter de mesures de sauvegarde ou d'activités alternatives génératrices de revenus pour les diverses parties prenantes, compensant les restrictions aux droits de propriété ou aux droits d'usage induites par la Constitution et les mesures de gestion d'une aire protégée. Malgré cela, l'équilibre entre ces deux enjeux est généralement précaire dans un pays où la lutte contre la pauvreté et donc la survie reste la priorité majeure. Cela entraîne des risques liés à la temporalité entre la nécessité d'accéder maintenant au détriment de la provision de certains services écosystémiques dans une échelle de temps plus longue. L'évaluation du capital naturel permet de mieux cerner ces enjeux à des fins d'orientation de politique publique. En effet, à travers d'outils d'analyse des services écosystémiques, des valeurs, des utilisations et de l'offre que peut donner le capital naturel, ce type d'outil permet de trouver les compromis nécessaires entre ces priorités parfois concurrentes dans le temps. D'ailleurs, Madagascar est signataire de la déclaration de Gaborone pour la durabilité en Afrique et s'est engagé à garantir que les contributions du capital naturel à la croissance économique durable, le maintien et l'amélioration du capital social et du bien-être humain soient quantifiées et intégrées dans le développement et les pratiques économiques. Les études menées sur la valeur de l'aire protégée d'Ankarafansk, une aire protégée au nord-ouest de Madagascar, ont démontré que, premièrement, le service écosystémique de séquestration de carbone du PNA est assuré par les 75 108 hectares de forêt dense et 34 269 hectares de forêt secondaire. En termes économiques, ce service ferait approximativement 10 845 900 de crédits carbone en 2019, soit 135 milliards d'ariars sur une valeur actuelle. Deuxièmement, les besoins primaires des ménages vivant aux abords du parc national ne sont satisfaits que partiellement par l'utilisation des terres actuellement observées. Cette situation est liée à des conditions structurelles de pauvreté et de manque de connaissance des techniques agricoles, à des difficultés d'accès à la terre, aux capacités d'investissement limitées et enfin à l'organisation globale de la gestion des parcelles. Les pratiques dégradantes aggravent la situation des paysages sur les parcelles situées dans les zones en aval qui sont ensablées par les sédiments issus des pertes en terre en amont. 13% des pertes en terre évaluées au sein du sous-bassin versant du parc national d'Ankarafansk sont dues à la déforestation à l'intérieur du parc lui-même. De plus, la variabilité de la disponibilité alimentaire se traduit par des pressions accrues à l'intérieur du parc national en période de soudure. Une meilleure planification territoriale avec des activités spécifiques de gestion durable des terres autour du parc est ainsi primordiale. Troisièmement, les modélisations réalisées ont prédit plusieurs scénarios de sédimentation dans la plaine de Marvoy à l'horizon 2030 en fonction de la conservation du parc national d'Ankarafansk. Selon le scénario proposant une bonne gestion du parc et du territoire, les sédiments provenant du parc se déposant dans la plaine de Marvoy recouvreraient une surface de 1822 hectares contre 2353 hectares en l'absence de conservation du parc et de planification territoriale. C'est donc 531 hectares de rizières qui peuvent être préservés avec une bonne gestion du parc. En ce qui concerne les actions et les ambitions de Madagascar pour une meilleure prise en compte de la valeur de l'environnement et de la nature dans la prise de décision, et pour la conservation, l'utilisation durable et l'investissement dans le capital naturel, nous avons opté pour la réforme de la gouvernance des aires protégées. Cette réforme prend en compte d'un côté la conservation et la gestion des aires protégées au sein d'un paysage et de l'autre côté la valorisation du capital naturel et le financement durable. Pour la conservation et la gestion des aires protégées au sein d'un paysage, nous savons tous que les aires protégées font partie intégrante du paysage plus large, géré par différents acteurs venant de différents secteurs gouvernementaux et ou privés, avec des objectifs et plans territoriaux multiples répondant à un but plus large. Par conséquent, l'aire protégée devrait s'inscrire dans un emboîtement d'échelle qui permette à la fois de répondre aux engagements nationaux et internationaux en termes de conservation et aux objectifs et enjeux de développement durable au niveau local, communal et régional. En ce qui concerne la valorisation du capital naturel et du financement durable, Madagascar a commencé à planifier un programme de croissance verte et bleue. Les aires protégées représentent l'une des stratégies les plus disponibles pour relever ces défis en promouvant la valorisation financière et durable des ressources biologiques, naturelles et culturelles et des services écosystémiques. Bien que les investissements initiaux soient élevés, les dividendes écologiques, socio et économiques à long terme peuvent être énormes.
It's an excellent contribution from Her Excellency, really showing us what is possible. And I think, Dr. Zattler, you'd be happy to hear the comment that she made about how they've managed to incentivize the private sector to take an active role in contributing to the conservation efforts in the Ankara-Vinca National Park in Madagascar. But one of the things that she also speaks about is something that we're now going to hear Professor Dr. Kevin Chika-Uram from the African Development Bank, who is the Senior Director looking after the African Development Institute. And we're going to hear him talking about the importance of not looking at short-term resource allocation as a trade-off to long-term ecosystem preservation, and how the challenge really is how do we do both and do those both intentionally. And of course, listen out to a special joint program that he's going to be talking about between the African Development Bank and BMZ. And of course, this speaks to very much one of the key themes that we've been touching on, that is the theme of partnerships and international partners coming together, as Joe's words earlier, to make sure that we take the pressure off our jewelry box as we try and value what is inside. Turn your attention now, ladies and gentlemen, to Professor Dr. Kevin Chika-Urama.
Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, Heads of International Organizations, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to stand on established protocols. I'm deeply honored to speak to you briefly on this very important subject, mobilizing action for protecting Africa's natural assets, and the launch of the Africa's Protected Natural Assets Report. As noted in the report, Africa's natural wealth underpins the continent's current and future welfare. Nature's infrastructure also provides ecosystem services that are key to our social, economic, and environmental well-being. Yet, the focus on short-term economic growth objectives often constrain governments to overexploit or degrade their natural assets. Other exogenous factors, such as climate change impacts on key sectors that drive economic growth in countries, further deepens the challenge for decision makers. Do we conserve natural capital for the long term or exploit them for economic growth today? This is often the question. The above policy question, however, suggests a trade-off between conservation of natural capital and short-term economic growth objectives. This is and should not be the case. As aptly noted in the event website, destruction of natural capital not only causes serious harm to the planet, but also threatens the well-being and prosperity of people and economies. According to the World Bank report on Changing Wealth of Nations, published in 2018, natural capital makes up 30 to 50% of total wealth in many African countries. We also know that the beneficiation of this wealth of natural capital remains very low in Africa's natural resources value chains. as countries continue to export natural resources with limited value addition, often at very low prices. With adequate investments in beneficiation, African countries could significantly increase the economic productivity of these natural assets and hence their contribution to economic growth. The policy choice for African countries should therefore be about how to exploit natural capital sustainably, not whether to conserve them for tomorrow or exploit them oxymoronically for economic growth today. We know that through investments in sustainable intensification and value addition, countries can achieve more economic returns from their natural assets without depreciating them. With its rich endowment in natural capital, Africa holds a unique opportunity to build inclusive and sustainable wealth of its nations by investing in the beneficiation and conservation of its natural capital assets concurrently. This is the foundation for sustainable economic production and consumption in Africa and indeed globally. However, natural capital is often not considered in national accounting in many African countries and in the wealth of nations globally. As noted by the Dasgupta report published recently, an economy could record a high rate of GDP growth by depreciating its natural assets. But one would not know that this is occurring from the national statistics. According to the Finance for Biodiversity initiative published in 2020, on average, 28% of total investments of development finance institutions are exposed to nature-related risks. With the growing risks of natural disasters due to climate change and health pandemics such as COVID-19, this class of risk is only set to increase over time. This is the reason the African Development Bank Group, together with its partners, including the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, WWF, GIZ, and other partners, with support by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, and the MAVA Foundation, has initiated a program on mainstreaming natural capital in development financing in Africa. The program aims to provide a business case for financing natural capital as an asset class, integrating natural capital assets in sovereign credit ratings of countries and building capacity for natural capital accounting in African countries. The social, economic, and environmental impacts of unsustainable management of natural capital is sometimes irreversible. Nature-positive development pathways that manage the global portfolio of nature's assets sustainably is therefore a necessary condition for achieving resilient and sustainable economic growth everywhere. I commend the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, for organizing this conversation on protecting Africa's natural assets. The African Development Bank Group stands ready to work with its partners to harness Africa's natural capital for a green, resilient, and sustainable development of Africa. I wish you fruitful deliberations and look forward to the recommendations on what needs to be done to better recognize the value of nature in decision-making, practical and implementable actions to conserve the continent's wealth in natural capital, increase investments in their beneficiation and sustainable use so that we can achieve inclusive and sustainable growth in African countries. Thank you very much.
And that last question Professor Orama put to us, he said in his final statement, What needs to be done? And that's the theme that we're going to be turning our focus now, especially as we look to best practice around how might we go about raising ambitions, how might we go about mobilizing investments, and as Professor Rama said, what needs to be done. So maybe let me come to you first, Madame Ruweza, because we know that the WWF is engaged in natural capital projects in Mozambique, in Madagascar, and in other parts of the continent. And maybe could you lift one or two examples of best practice that you believe would benefit African conservation?
Thank you, Notsi. WWF has been a strong promoter of the use of natural capital assessment and accounting in planning processes, particularly with partners. Of course, the same partners you have here with the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and others have all been involved in this natural capital accounting. And the essence really is to ensure that the values of Africa's rich ecosystems are considered as an integral part of decision making, whether around a very concrete investment, for example, the construction of a road or a hydropower dam, or for broader government policies. So I'll give you an example in Mozambique. In Mozambique, we supported the use of natural capital assessments in the management plan of the Primeras and Segundas multi-use conservation area. Now, by translating ecosystem services functions provided by water, forests, land, and other natural resources into tangible economic terms, and subsequently using these as input into the planning process and stakeholder consultation, we made sure that the management plan for that conservation area took better account of such often forgotten benefits provided by nature. We also worked at a national scale, again partnering with the government of Mozambique and the African Development Bank in the development of a national green economy roadmap and action plan. And this plan makes specific reference to the establishment of natural capital accounts. And we even supported a number of sector-specific analysis to feed into this process. But we're seeing this growing now. We have a very vibrant natural capital accounting community, Africa community of practice, which I really have to call out for. And we're starting to see examples coming on that community of practice from Ethiopia, from Botswana, and others. So there is growth in this area, but it hasn't been institutionalized yet. And we really need to do much more in making sure that these values are integrated into policy. And we're hoping that through this community of practice and through sharing these values and sharing examples from other countries, we'll start to see this grow. Over.
Madame Ruweza, I think it's a fantastic contribution, and I'm going to sneak in a question to you, Joe. I'm sneaking in a question from our audience because I think it flows beautifully from the challenge that Madame Ruweza has raised, and she's saying we haven't institutionalized, we haven't formalized. So there's a question from Estelle Herlin, and Estelle is saying, let's talk about carbon credits. Why not make SDG credits of them, even higher economic value of them, since we need a holistic approach? So why are we not thinking innovatively and maybe bringing in SDG credits as part of the way that we are quantifying carbon credits and really making them a pathway towards sustainable development? What do you think of Estelle's thought, Joe?
Nozi, I don't have much to say about the SDG credit, but let me just say that in terms of carbon credit, there is something very important that Africans are looking at. You remember that the RED, reduced emission from deforestation and forest degradation. Yeah, this thing has started in 2005. Until today, African countries have not been able to benefit from the carbon credits. It's only this year that the first country, I think it is Gabon, that received some money from Norway. Now that we are trying to mobilize as much money as possible, many countries in Africa protecting forests, for example, they would like to see some return from that. They would like to be paid for that ecosystem service. So that I can tell you, but the credit for SDG, I'm not very much aware of those. Thank you.
Lovely. It's an open question and it's an invitation, I think, what Estelle has done in terms of opening up our thinking around that. But Dr. Fergele, let me go to you. We know that the World Bank is one of the key international supporters for integrating natural capital and biodiversity in national accounts. And maybe the question to you, because we know that this is so important in how we go beyond GDP, as in terms of really recognizing and valuing the size of our economies. Can you maybe give us one or two examples of how these approaches are influencing and maybe even changing development pathways, and maybe one or two lessons that we can learn from them?
Well, thank you, Nosy. I'm totally with Alice here and what we've heard before, right? We are having a lot of good examples in a number of African countries and around the world. And we at the World Bank support over 20 countries at the moment doing exactly what you just described, Nosy, and what Alice was saying, right? To raise awareness, to make people better understand what is the true value of managing those ecosystem services better, and and avoiding ignorance and just looking straight at GDP and compromising long-term benefits for society and people in the region and in the country for short-term gains. And I think this is a real profound effort, because it challenges the traditional way of thinking about what wealth of nations means. We have been publishing the Wealth of Nations report for years now, and as Alice was saying earlier, we have now really emphasized the value of natural capital. And when you look at this carefully, and one of the audience members asked the question, do we really know enough about the value? No, we don't, because it's intrinsically very difficult to fully quantify what it means to maintain or even strengthen and sustain these ecosystem services and biodiversity. We only feel the pain when we lose it. Look at the pollinators right now. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars of annual agriculture value simply by having insects out there pollinating our crops. And so there we could do an estimate and an assessment. And another very good one is mangroves. It was featured in one of the video clips earlier. We now have a much better understanding what the true value is of maintaining a mangrove belt in a coastal area where millions of people are protected against a storm surge and things like that. So over time, we're building a body of understanding of what the economics are. I can only say in our latest study, which hasn't been quoted, I think, yet, is we estimate that more than half of the world's GDP depends in one form or another on ecosystem services or biodiversity contributions. If we lose that, we are at risk of losing a huge part of the GDP, right, globally. And I think for economists, they're beginning now to fully recognize that there is not just financial and economic capital, there is also human capital and there is natural capital. And over the last decade or two, we have really furthered our understanding that it is absolutely essential to see them at the same level as the others. And that when you work on policy making, you really have to understand the full consequences of what you're doing with policy. So this is why this work is so intensely important. I can give you a number of examples. At Cambodia, we helped them make the case, the Cambodian government, for why it is more sensible and strategic and economically and socially and everything else, the right decision to maintain 60% of their forest cover rather than cutting it down. Because when you really look at the value added, it's 20 times the cost that would be associated with not doing it. So, those kinds of studies over and over again show how critically important this kind of work is. I cannot overemphasize how important it is. And maybe let me make one brief other point, because it has been discussed before. At the end of the day, it's about people. Again, Alice made this point, right? You cannot conserve nature and biodiversity at the expense of involving people. You cannot protect your forest if people are hungry. But you also cannot feed people if you don't have functioning ecosystem services. So these policy packages have to focus on people. Somebody from the environment community said once to me, Jürgen, environment doesn't need management. Trees don't need to be managed. They manage themselves really well if you leave them alone. What needs management is the people around them. That's where the focus needs to be, right? And there has to be a fair, equitable, just, balanced approach to this. It's not either or. And we have now, WWF and many others have very good examples of how to do this right.
Dr. Fergala, that's a really incredible contribution, and of course, I don't think that any of us will forget the analogy of the trees that are doing a really good job of managing themselves. But maybe just a quick follow up to you before we move on is because we've spent a little bit of time talking about best practice. I want us to talk a bit about the future, and we know that the future requires financing and requires investments. And the research is telling us that there are enormous gaps for biodiversity finance. How can we better finance nature in your view? And what are the sources or the levers we should be looking to mobilize those investments?
Well, let's first maybe state what's happening today. Right now, the world spends about 100, 120, $130 billion a year, all in, depends on how you count it, and helping protecting biodiversity and conservation. That's a significant amount of money, but it's of course much too little for what is really needed. And rather than hoping that for some out of nowhere, somewhere, there will be huge amounts of money added to this, because at the end of the day, certainly during COVID and during the economic crisis that we are facing globally right now, there is not a lot of additional money out there. So what's really important is for governments to look at what they are doing with their existing resources right now. One of the biggest headaches that I've worked with in the World Bank in interacting with our clients is the conversation around how do you spend your public money? How much of that money are you using for subsidies in the energy sector, notably fossil fuel subsidies or agricultural subsidies? Just agricultural subsidies alone, I don't know whether you know the number. Globally, governments spend $650 billion on agricultural subsidies right now, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because you want to support your poor farmers and you want to do the right thing. But the problem is that those subsidies, only a very small portion of them actually have nature positive outcomes. And I think one of the big areas, very important policy areas, is to have a conversation around how can you continue, not necessarily reduce the agricultural subsidies, but how can you actually provide support to your farming community to do the kinds of things that are not detrimental to nature and biodiversity, but actually are a win-win, that give you high production, high productivity, give you good income, but at the same time are nature positive. And this is not abstract or academic. There are a good number of examples now around the world. If we had more time, I can share some of them with you, where government have realized, actually, you can have a win-win. You can support the farmer to do something which maintains the yield or even increases the yield. And the report points to some of those. Actually, the BMZ GIZ report points to some of those. And those are very important, while at the same time provide you with environmental better outcomes, lower carbon dioxide footprint or methane footprint for parts of agriculture, and better health and nutrition outcomes. And governments have not really had this conversation across the board. There is massive potential to create these win-win-wins. I'll just give you this one example. I know we are pressed for time, but there are several others where you can look at existing financing, rather than always say, where is the next grant from BMZ? But to sort of really look at what you have and then see how you can repurpose some of that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fergele. I did see Dr. Zettler keeping a straight face as you're talking about the grants that are going to be knocking. Because that's where I'm coming to next.
Those will be helpful too.
Dr. Zettler, I wanted to put a question to you, but I'm going to put two questions, because there's a question from our audience that is even better than my question. So I really just wanted to find out, what role can development cooperation play in financing nature in Africa? But there's a question here that says, it's a better question than mine because it's more specific. It says, what will be Germany's contribution to mobilizing the necessary financial resources to make whether it's the 30 by 30 targets a reality, but ultimately to ensuring that all that we're speaking about, that we're making the desired progress in the right direction? Your thoughts, please, Dr. Zettler.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So first, I would like to link what my fellow Jürgen just said. I really share his view that very much is not about additional financing, is to redirect financing. And therefore, what we have to do is to change policies, to change regulatory frameworks. It doesn't cost a cent. On the contrary, it can bring money to the public purse. For example, if you get rid of environmentally harmful subsidies, if you introduce environmental taxes, this is good for your fiscal accounts. So that's the first line of defense. And that's also, until end of last year, I was executive director at the World Bank, and that's what I always argued for. You don't need more money. You need more money, but the first line of defense is to change policies And the World Bank and the German government should help our partner governments to do that change. And there we have to do with time inconsistencies, of course, because sometimes it pays out in the longer term, but it costs in the short term. And therefore, we have to help countries to get over this time inconsistency. And that's what we also started to do. And I would like to refer to one example, Côte d'Ivoire. There, 2 years ago, we joined forces, the World Bank and the German government, and we gave a development policy loan to the government of Côte d'Ivoire. And this development policy loan was to change policies linked to natural habitats, linked to biodiversity, linked to climate change. So we gave money to help them over this short-term, perhaps, problems. We knew that in the long term it pays out, and there we gave money together with the World Bank, the German government with the World Bank, budget support. So that's something you can do. And then you have to change the policies and you need technical expertise. There I very much rely on our GIZ. But of course, it's very much country specific and we need to build up this expertise, further build up. Okay, that's the first line of defense. And then, of course, what you also have to do is to bring the private contributions in. It is very promising that many companies and financial institutions are realizing that their business models depend on nature and are willing to invest in conservation. And on that backdrop, just to give you another example, BMZ recently initiated with private donors the Legacy Landscape Fund. And the objective of this fund is to provide long-term financing for globally important protected areas, but the financing comes from private companies. So my last point, of course, we also need more public investments. It's about policy, regulatory frameworks, it's about private contribution, but it's also about public investments. And because there was the question, my government is ready to step up its efforts and financial contributions. We need a significant increase of ODI for biodiversity. In 2021, my ministry is planning to invest more than 600 million euro for biodiversity conservation. This is an increase of 50% compared to previous years. And just to give you another telling example, currently Germany is supporting protected areas with an extension of about 6 times the surface of Germany. So we are very engaged in that area, and we are ready to scale up our engagements. But of course, we also hope that our partner countries will do the necessary choices, because we know if we engage more, but there is no ownership on the side of the African governments, then the whole thing will be in vain. Therefore, we prefer to work with partners who really are committed to go that way and to be champions and to change policies and regulatory frameworks. We prefer to work with those partners, and we would like to focus our financial support also to those countries.
Dr. Zettler, it's an excellent contribution, 6 times the surface area of Germany. But what I've heard you saying is partnership, together with partner governments working towards a shared and a common goal. Now, I'm going to do something very unfair to my panelists, but they don't have a choice. They'll just have to go along as we close off this conversation. Now, we have 1 minute left, and what I'd like to do is I'd like us to just focus on the call to action. One action that you think we could all take. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about African and international community, as Dr. Zettler has just spoken about. What one action could we take from tomorrow that would take us even further towards valuing our natural capital and ensuring that we are mobilizing the necessary areas for the protection of Africa's natural resources. Now, the trick here is that I want you to think about this as just one sentence. It's going to be on the news at 7 p.m. So no executive summary, no long paragraph, no long speech, no more than 10 words. And your sentence starts with one action we could take. One action we could take, and complete the sentence. And that's how we're going to close it off. So I'm looking at the faces and I'm seeing who looks the most ready. Joe, I think you certainly look like you've got the
No.
best one.
No.
So
Give me a minute.
if you could complete the sentence, one action we could take, what is the rest of the sentence?
Please, give me a minute.
Okay, I'm going to go to Dr. Zatla. I think his hand is going up. Dr. Zatla, one action we could take.
I don't want to urge, but I think I'm ready. You know, one action we could take is to draw up budget support for countries who are really willing to go that way. And the World Bank could facilitate that. Germany could join in. GIZ could play a role helping governments to draw up best practice together with the World Bank. And then if we have a good example, more good examples, we can replicate.
Thank you. So that's a short bulletin in the news, but draw up support for countries who are willing to go that way. And I heard the World Bank could be an active partner. So Dr. Fergala, what do you say to that? One action we could take. What's the rest of the sentence?
Look, one action for every country would be to review your public policies and how you are spending your money right now, and make them all nature positive.
Thank you. Review your public policy and make sure they're all nature positive. So I'm going all the way to Madame Rueza. Madame Rueza, one action we could take.
One action we could take is to make conserving nature everyone's business. Not just us who work in conservation, but everybody. Everybody, a whole engaged society.
I love that. Make conservation of nature everyone's business. That's certainly a headline for the news. So back to you, Joe. One action we could take. So how do you take us home today?
Is to be able to highlight the benefits we can get from protected natural assets in Africa, and then communicate that to everybody, decision makers, but also local communities, indigenous people, so that we understand the benefits, we see them, we feel them, we agree, and then we can continue with protected areas. Otherwise, people will feel,
That's a news bulletin as well, but highlight the benefits, communicate them to all, and bring everybody in. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, allow me just to shortly introduce a final word who's going to close us off before I thank my panelists. That's Madame Elizabeth Maruma Mrema. She is, of course, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. Here are a few remarks from her as she closes us off for today.
Good day, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. The impacts of biodiversity loss, land degradation, desertification, and climate change have become global environmental challenges that threaten the richness and diversity of life on Earth. These drivers of biodiversity loss crises now exacerbate each other and undermine our efforts to achieve sustainable development. Africa has been hit particularly hard. Africa is very rich in biodiversity. The continent holds as much as a quarter of all global biodiversity. Africa supports the Earth's largest intact groups of large animals. Africa's biomass extends from mangroves to deserts, from Mediterranean to tropical forests, from temperate to subtropical and mountain grasslands and savanna, and even ice-capped mountains. However, Despite many efforts, Africa is still experiencing loss of biodiversity and facing challenges in reconciling human well-being with environmental and economic prosperity. Creating and maintaining mechanisms to protect the variety of life is therefore crucial. Convention on Biological Diversity parties have long recognized that protected and conserved areas constitute important stocks of natural, cultural, and social capital. They yield flows of valuable goods and services that benefit humanity. By maintaining biodiversity, these areas also support resilience to changing socio-economic and environmental conditions. It is also recognized that they deliver multiple benefits when they are effectively managed and equitably governed with full participation, inclusiveness, and transparency, including the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities and youth. Despite many challenges, the world is making progress in the implementation of the strategic plan for biodiversity. I am pleased to report that we are on track to meet the Aichi Biodiversity Target 11, thereby also Target 14.5 of the Sustainable Development Goals before our next Conference of the Parties 15. This shows that with concerted efforts by all, globally agreed targets are possible to achieve. In this way, the world is ready for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the implementation of more ambitious conservation targets for the 2021-2030 period. The organization of this event and the launch of this report represents a way to harness this positive energy and momentum. I believe that the discussions you had during this event will benefit not only Africa, but also other regions, and will help contribute to the achievement of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and other international agreements and processes. I extend my appreciation and gratitude to BMZ and contributors and publishers of the Protected Natural Assets Report. This report will enhance understanding and encourage engagement and willingness for concerted efforts and will complement other initiatives, including the recently launched the African Union Green Recovery Action Plan. It will also contribute to the upcoming First Africa Protected Areas Congress that will be held in March 2022. The report being launched today will encourage vertical integration among member states and horizontal and intersectorial integration in line with Agenda 2063 of the African Union. With appropriate institutional and governance frameworks, this can help align and map activities for implementation to achieve national and international goals and targets. This will also allow us to reap multiple benefits for the well-being of not only current, but also the future generations. The next 10 years will be very critical for the tasks ahead of us. In the work of our discussions today, let us strive to hold and reverse the current crisis, build back better and greener, and move forward life in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Now that is an incredible call to action. I hope that it's resonated with each and every one of us. As we wrap up our conversations today, let's be clear that this is an invitation to roll up our sleeves, to accelerate in action, to partner and pull together our strengths, to be courageous enough to review our policies and make the necessary changes that not only will allow us to deliver on the Africa we want, but certainly allow us to deliver on the world we want. It's a massive thank you to our panelists, Dr. Jürgen Zattler, Dr. Jürgen Fergeler, Madame Alice Rueza, Professor Dr. Kalamani Joe Mulungoy, all for joining us, and of course, Madame Vera Schultz and Professor Hans-Jürgen right at the beginning, who spoke to us. From myself, Nozi Poshabalala, at the tip of the African continent in South Africa, it's goodbye for now.